There is a stretch of road 41 miles north of a station most maps don't bother naming, and on the night I want to tell you about, I plowed it the way I'd plowed it 200 times before. Same blade angle. Same speed. Same reflector posts ticking past my window like a slow heartbeat. When I reached the turnaround at the end of the run, I did what I always did. I checked my mirrors before backing the truck around. The road behind me was already plowed. Not recently plowed. Not someone came through after me. Plowed in my pattern. My exact pattern, the slight drift I have to the left on mile 36 because of a frost heave only I seem to correct for. I sat there with the engine idling and the heater ticking, and I did the thing you do when your body understands something before your mind will let you say it out loud. I didn't turn around and drive back through it to check. I want to be honest about that. I sat in the cab for 11 minutes, according to the clock, and I did not look behind me again until the sun came up. That's the part one keep coming back to, on the nights I can't sleep. Not what might have been out there. What I chose not to look at. My name doesn't matter much for this. What matters is that I've driven plow routes in the Alaskan interior for 6 winters, and I took the contract for the Harlan Ridge Access Road because it paid almost double what the borough routes paid, and because the recruiter on the phone told me the job was mostly just keeping one road open for one building, which sounded, at the time, like the easiest money I'd ever make. Harlan Ridge is a weather monitoring station. That's the official language. A squat, wind-scoured cluster of buildings sitting on a shelf of rock above the tree line, 41 miles from the nearest town that still has a gas station, connected to the rest of the world by one road that I was hired to keep open through the winter months, and by a satellite link that the station's staff use for their reports. I arrived in late September, before the real snow, in a truck that smelled like the previous driver's cigarettes and pine air freshener fighting each other to a draw. The station manager, a quiet, sun-cracked man named Dale who'd clearly spent more winters up there than he wanted to talk about, walked me through the compound in about 20 minutes. There wasn't much to see. A main building with the radio room, the server racks, and a kitchen that ran on propane. A secondary building unheated, that housed the plow's fuel tanks and a generator shed. A row of instrument towers strung along the ridge like skeletal fingers, each one blinking a slow red light against the gray sky. "You'll mostly keep to yourself," Dale said, which I took as a simple statement of the job, not a warning. "Storms come fast up here. When the board says plow, you plow before it gets bad, not during." There were 4 other people stationed there through that winter, 2 meteorological techs, a maintenance engineer, and a cook who also handled the radio relay when nobody else could. I learned their names quickly and their habits slowly, the way you do when isolation forces you into close quarters with people who've already decided how much of themselves they're going to show you. The work itself was almost soothingly dull, at first. I'd check the weather board before dawn, run the plow route if conditions called for it, do maintenance on the blade and hydraulics in the afternoon, and spend the evenings in the common room listening to the others talk about things that had nothing to do with weather, hockey, an ex-wife, a dog someone had left behind in Fairbanks. Normal talk. Tired talk. The kind of talk that makes you forget, for an hour or two, how far you are from anything. It was on my 9th day that I noticed the first thing that didn't sit right, though at the time I filed it away as nothing more than an odd habit of the crew. Every evening, around 8, one of the techs, a woman named Priya, would step outside alone for exactly 4 minutes to check the instrument shed, and every evening, the others would go quiet until she came back in. Not nervous quiet. Practice quiet. Like a held breath they'd done so many times it had stopped feeling like holding a breath at all. I asked Dale about it once, casually, over coffee. He told me it was just a routine check. And then he changed the subject so smoothly, so completely, that I didn't notice I'd been redirected until I was already talking about something else entirely. I didn't think much of it that night. I want to be clear about that, because it's important to how this story works. I didn't feel afraid. I felt, at most, a small itch of curiosity, the kind you get when you notice a coworker does something slightly strange and file it under personality rather than warning. It wasn't until the following week, when I pulled the weather log to cross-reference against my plow schedule, that I found the first gap, a storm system that had clearly passed through the region, one I remembered driving through myself, arms tight on the wheel the entire time, that simply did not appear anywhere in the station's official records. I want to walk you through what a normal day at Harlan Ridge actually looked like, because the horror of this story, if you want to call it that, never announced itself. It leaked in through the cracks of a routine so ordinary that for weeks I mistook wrongness for boredom. My mornings started at 5:30, before anyone else was up except Priya, who ran the 6 a.m. atmospheric readings. I'd check the plow board, a whiteboard nailed to the wall of the radio room with a crude sketch of the road and a series of handwritten codes that told me visibility, wind loading, and drift risk for the day. If the board said, "Clear," I ran the route. If it said, "Hold," I stayed in. The plowing itself was simple, mechanical work. Lower the blade, set the speed, watch the edges of your headlights for the reflector posts that mark where the road actually is versus where the snow tells you it might be. Alaska teaches you fast that the road and the snow covering it are two different objects that only sometimes agree with each other. In the afternoons I did maintenance, and in the evenings I sat in the common room with the crew and we did the things isolated people do to manufacture the illusion of normal life: cards, bad movies on a hard drive someone had smuggled in years ago, complaints about the propane smell in Building 2. The first thing I want to describe as off wasn't dramatic. It was a silence. Any time someone brought up a storm that had happened more than a few days prior, the conversation would simply stop. Not awkwardly. Not with any visible discomfort on anyone's face. It would just end, the way a sentence ends, and then someone would say something about dinner, and the moment would be gone before I could even register that it had been a moment at all. I brought this up once, gently, to the maintenance engineer, a heavy-set, soft-spoken man named Robert who'd been at Harlan Ridge for going on 4 years. I asked him what the biggest storm he'd seen up there was. He looked at me for a second too long before he answered. "They're all about the same, after a while," he said, and went back to his coffee. That answer has stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this story, because it was such a small, forgettable non-answer, and yet something in the way he said it told me, even then, even before I understood anything, that it was a rehearsed kind of forgetting. Not a lie exactly. A well-worn groove in his mind that he walked through so he wouldn't have to walk through the actual memory underneath it. I started keeping my own log, informally, in a notebook I kept in my jacket pocket. Nothing sophisticated, just dates, weather conditions, plow times, and anything that struck me as unusual. I told myself it was for my own records, in case the contract company ever disputed my hours. That was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. 3 weeks in, I compared my notebook against the station's official weather log, which was kept in a battered green binder in the radio room, transcribed by hand from the instrument readings each night. There was a storm I remembered clearly, a fast-moving system that had dropped visibility to almost nothing for 6 hours on a Tuesday, forcing me to abandon the plow route halfway through and waited out in the cab with the engine running, watching my own headlights get swallowed by white maybe 4 feet in front of the hood. It was, without question, the worst weather I had personally driven through since arriving. It was not in the binder. Not mentioned. Not logged. The Tuesday entry skipped directly from a routine morning reading to a routine evening reading, as though the day between them had simply not happened, meteorologically speaking, even though I had the frostbite on 2 fingers to prove otherwise. I told myself, at first, that it was a clerical error. People forget to log things. Isolated stations run on tired, overworked staff, and tired, overworked staff make mistakes. But when I checked further back in the binder, flipping through months of entries with a coffee going cold beside me, I found the pattern repeating. Not every storm. Not even most storms. But every so often, maybe one system in 6 or 7, there would be a gap exactly where I remembered the weather being at its strangest. Not just bad. Strange. The kind of storm where the wind seemed to change direction without ever seeming to blow from anywhere at all. I closed the binder and sat there for a long time, listening to the wind test the corners of the building the way it always did, except now the sound didn't feel like weather anymore. It felt like something waiting outside a door, patient, in no hurry, because it already knew the door would eventually open. That night, for the first time since I'd arrived, I locked my bedroom door before I went to sleep, a habit I'd normally consider paranoid, ridiculous, entirely unnecessary in a building this remote. I told myself it was about the cold air in the hallway. I didn't believe myself even as I thought it. Once you notice one gap, you start looking for the others, and once you start looking, you can't stop, even when a part of you wants to. Over the next 2 weeks I cross-referenced every storm I could remember against the binder, and against the informal notes I'd started keeping. What I found wasn't a clean pattern, it was worse than that. It was almost a pattern. Close enough to feel deliberate, loose enough that I could never quite prove it to myself, which is its own particular kind of exhausting. The missing storms all shared a few qualities, when I laid them out. They moved faster than the forecast models predicted. They dropped the ambient temperature in ways that didn't match the pressure readings, as if the cold were arriving from somewhere other than the air itself. And every single one of them, according to my notes, had happened on a night when Priya went out for her 4-minute instrument check. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to make this sound more organized than it felt at the time. It didn't feel like a conspiracy. It felt like watching people repeat a private ritual they'd stopped questioning years before I arrived, the way people stop questioning why they knock on wood, or why they don't walk under ladders. Superstition wearing the clothing of procedure. The radio started acting strange around the same time I noticed the pattern, though I can't say for certain the two things are connected, only that they happen together. Robert monitored the overnight frequency most nights, relaying our status to the regional office in case of emergency. I was in the common room one night, unable to sleep, when I heard him say, quietly, into the receiver, "Say again, we're not reading you," followed by a long stretch of static that had a texture to it I'd never heard static have before, not white noise, but something with rhythm buried inside it, like a voice trying to organize itself out of the interference, and never quite managing it. Robert set the receiver down without logging the contact attempt. I asked him who'd been calling. "Nobody," he said. "Dead air does that sometimes up here. Atmospheric bounce." He said it in the same rehearsed tone I'd started to recognize from everyone at the station, the tone of an answer that had been given so many times and no longer needed to make sense, only to be said. That was the same week I began losing small amounts of time. It started with something forgettable, coming out of the equipment shed and realizing 40 minutes had passed that I couldn't account for, when the task I'd gone out to do should have taken 10. I told myself I'd lost track while distracted, the way anyone does. But it happened again 3 days later, this time while I was simply walking the short distance between the main building and the fuel shed, a walk I'd timed at 90 seconds more times than I could count. I checked the clock in the main building when I got back. Nearly 30 minutes had passed since I'd left. Nobody else seemed to think this was strange. When I mentioned it, carefully, testing the water, Dale told me the cold does that. "Time gets slippery out here," he said, with the same practiced calm as everything else. "You'll get used to it." I did not want to get used to it. The following night, during a storm that was, according to the board, an unremarkable weather event, I heard something outside the building that I have tried, many times since, to describe accurately, and I've never managed to do it justice. It wasn't a howl. It wasn't the wind working through the instrument towers, which has its own particular whine I'd grown used to. It was closer to a low, structural groan, the kind a large object makes when weight shifts on it, except there was nothing outside large enough to make that sound, nothing except the empty ridge and the dark and the snow moving sideways past the window in sheets thick enough to swallow the porch light whole. I stood at the window for a long time, watching the snow, telling myself it was the wind finding some new angle against the building, some structural quirk of a place I hadn't lived in long enough to understand yet. Then, for just a moment, less than a second, gone before I could be sure I'd seen it at all, the falling snow in front of the porch light seemed to bend around something that wasn't there. A shape the snow moved around instead of through, the way water bends around a rock in a stream, there and then not there, leaving me standing at the window with my breath fogging the glass and no way to explain what I just watched the storm do. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in the common room with every light on, and I did not tell anyone what I'd seen, because some part of me, some old, animal part, understood that saying it out loud would make it real in a way I wasn't ready for, and because a smaller, colder part of me suspected they already knew. There's a room at Harlan Ridge that isn't on the tour Dale gave me when I arrived. I don't think that was intentional, exactly. It's more that the tour simply skipped it the way a sentence skips a word you don't need to finish the thought. It's a narrow storage room off the back hallway of the main building, behind a door that sticks in the cold and takes a hard shoulder to open, and I only found it because I was looking for a spare filter for the plow's hydraulic line, and Robert had mentioned, in passing, that the old parts were kept in the back. What I found in the back wasn't parts. It was records. Boxes of them, stacked along one wall on metal shelving that had rusted at the joints, going back, based on the handwriting styles and the yellowing of the paper, decades further than the current station's official history seemed to account for. Dale had told me Harlan Ridge had operated continuously since the late 70s. The oldest box I found was dated 11 years before that. I sat on an overturned crate in that cold little room, my breath visible in the beam of my flashlight, and I went through as much as I could before I had to convince myself to stop, because some part of what I was reading felt like it was reading me back. The records weren't standard weather logs. They were something closer to a second set of books, a shadow ledger running parallel to the binder in the radio room, documenting the same date ranges but with entirely different language. Where the official binder used clean meteorological terms, pressure systems, temperature gradients, wind shear, these older records used words like presence, approach interval, and more than once a phrase that appeared throughout multiple decades of handwriting in different hands. The road remembers. I didn't understand that phrase then. I'm not certain I fully understand it now. But I copied it into my notebook with a hand that wasn't entirely steady, because something in my chest recognized it before my mind did, the same way my body had recognized the plowed road behind me before I let myself look at it directly. There were maps in one of the boxes, hand-drawn, showing the access road I plowed every day, marked with a series of small red circles at irregular intervals, none of which corresponded to any landmark I recognized. Besides several of the circles, in a cramped, careful hand, someone had written dates. Some of the dates matched storms I had personally driven through. Some of them were decades old. I found a personnel log near the bottom of one box, thin, water-damaged, difficult to read, listing names of station staff going back to the station's true founding, decades before its official record claimed. Several names had a small mark beside them, a simple dash, that I initially took for some kind of shift code. It wasn't until I found a more recent page, closer to the top of the stack, that I understood what the dash meant, because I recognized one of the names beside it. A tech who'd worked at Harlan Ridge 2 winters before mine, according to something Priya had mentioned once in passing. His name had a dash beside it too. I asked Priya about him, the next evening, as carefully as I could manage, framing it as idle curiosity about who'd worked the station before me. She went very still for a moment, not dramatically, just a small stillness, the kind you'd only notice if you were already watching for it, and then she said he'd transferred to a different station down south, and she hoped he was doing well, and then she asked me to pass the salt. I passed the salt. I did not believe her. I don't think she expected me to. What unsettled me most wasn't the records themselves, strange as they were. It was a detail I almost missed entirely. A folded note tucked inside the most recent box, in handwriting I didn't recognize, dated only 3 months before my own arrival at the station. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It simply read, in small, careful letters, as though written by someone trying very hard to stay calm while writing it. Whoever finds this next, you were meant to. Don't stop reading. Don't tell them you found it. I sat with that note for a long time in the cold and the dark, my flashlight beam trembling slightly against the concrete floor, and I understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with instinct, that someone had left that note specifically for whoever came looking, That the room wasn't hidden so much as it was waiting, patiently. The same way I was beginning to suspect everything at Harlan Ridge was patient, and that I had just become the next person the note was talking to. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, turned off my flashlight, and stood in the pitch dark for almost a full minute before I could make myself open the door and walk back into a hallway, because some part of me was suddenly, irrationally convinced that if I moved too quickly, something in that room would notice I'd been there at all. The storm that changed everything didn't arrive the way storms are supposed to arrive. I'd spent 6 winters reading Alaskan weather before this contract, and if there's one thing that experience teaches you, it's the shape of an approaching system, the way the sky flattens out to a uniform gray hours beforehand, the way the wind picks up in stages, testing its own strength before committing to anything. This storm skipped all of that. The board in the radio room went from clear to a code I'd never seen before, not hold, not any of the standard designations, but a single word Dale had written by hand. Shelter. I asked him what that meant. He didn't answer right away. He looked at the board for a long moment, the way you'd look at a diagnosis you'd been half expecting for years and still weren't ready to hear out loud, and then he said, "It means we stop working and we wait it out inside. All of us. Together." The temperature outside dropped 9 degrees in 11 minutes. I know this because I was standing at the thermometer when it happened, and I watched the needle move in a way that thermometers, in my experience, are not supposed to move, not gradually, the way cold air arrives, but in small, discrete jumps, as if something were periodically switching the temperature down like a dial, rather than the air itself simply losing heat. The instruments on the towers began giving readings that didn't correlate with each other. Wind speed on the northern tower registered near hurricane force while the southern tower, less than 200 yards away, showed almost no wind at all. Barometric pressure spiked and dropped in patterns that Priya, staring at the monitor with an expression I hadn't seen on her before, not fear, exactly, more like weary recognition, described as not real numbers. I asked her what she meant by that. "They're not measuring weather," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Not this time." The power in the main building flickered twice, then steadied, then flickered again in a pattern that felt deliberate, though I couldn't have told you why it felt that way except that it did. 3 short dips followed by a longer one, repeating, like something testing whether the lights would come back before deciding whether to commit to darkness. I want to describe what I felt in that moment as clearly as I can, because I think it matters more than what actually happened. I felt the specific, focused calm that comes right before panic, the kind where your body starts preparing itself for something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. My hands were steady. My breathing was steady. And underneath all of that steadiness was a current of something closer to grief than fear, an overwhelming sense that whatever was approaching the station had approached it many times before, and that everyone around me had simply run out of the capacity to be afraid of it in any way that showed on their faces anymore. Robert moved through the building methodically, closing shutters over windows I hadn't even known could be shuttered, checking seals on doors, running through a sequence of actions that had the unmistakable rhythm of muscle memory, the kind of practice motion you only develop by doing something so many times your body stops needing your mind's permission to do it. I asked him what we were preparing for. "The same thing we always prepare for," he said, without looking up from the door seal he was checking. "It'll pass. It always passes." "What is it?" I asked, and I remember my voice sounding smaller than I wanted it to. He finally looked at me, and for just a second, something moved behind his eyes that looked almost like an apology. "You'll understand less the longer you're here," he said. "Not more. I know that's backward. It's still true." Outside, the wind reached a pitch I hadn't heard before, not louder, exactly, but wrong in its texture, carrying a low undertone beneath the howl that didn't behave the way sound is supposed to behave, seeming to come from everywhere in the building at once rather than from any single direction outside it. Priya moved to the radio and began speaking into it in a flat, procedural voice, reciting numbers and coordinates I didn't recognize, a call-and-response ritual that clearly wasn't meant for the regional office, because nothing came back except that same rhythmic static, the kind that sounded like a voice trying to assemble itself and never quite succeeding. And then, from somewhere out past the instrument towers, past the reach of any window we hadn't already shuttered, I heard my name. Not shouted. Not urgent. Said the way someone says your name when they're simply trying to get your attention across a quiet room, calm, familiar, entirely wrong given that nobody outside the building could possibly know I was there, and every single person inside the building was standing close enough that I could see all of their mouths, and none of them were moving. I froze for what felt like a long time, though Priya later told me it was only a few seconds, watching four people who had clearly heard the same thing I'd heard and had chosen, deliberately, not to react to it. "Don't answer it," Dale said quietly, to no one in particular, as though this were a rule so obvious it barely needed stating. "Whatever you hear tonight, don't answer it, and don't go looking for where it came from." That was the first time anyone at Harlan Ridge had given me an explicit instruction about the storms, rather than a deflection, and the specificity of it frightened me more than the vague unease of the previous weeks had managed to. What followed was procedure, real, practiced procedure, the kind that only exists because it has been refined, over years, by people who needed it to work. Robert killed the main lights in the common room, leaving only a single battery lantern glowing dimly on the table, its light deliberately dim, I realized, rather than simply weak. Priya taped a strip of black cloth over the small window in the radio room door. Dale moved from person to person, checking that we all had our jackets within reach, not for warmth, he said, but in case we need to move fast and can't wait to find them. I asked what we might need to move fast for. Nobody answered. The temperature inside the building began dropping, not sharply, but steadily, in a way that made no sense given the heaters were running at full output. I checked, twice, convinced something had failed, and both times found the systems working exactly as they should, producing heat that the air in the room seemed to simply refuse to hold on to. At some point, I genuinely cannot tell you how long into the night, because this was one of the periods where my sense of elapsed time simply stopped functioning reliably, the sound outside shifted from a howl into something closer to breathing. Long, slow intervals of near silence followed by a rush of wind against the building that had a rhythm too even, too intentional, to be weather in any sense I understood the word. Priya sat very close to the radio, not speaking into it anymore, just listening, her hand resting on the receiver like she was monitoring a patient's pulse. Every so often she'd glance at Dale, and he'd give a small shake of his head, and she'd relax slightly, and I understood, without being told, that they were listening for something specific, some particular sound within the static that would tell them whether whatever was outside was moving toward the building or away from it. Around what the clock claimed was 2 in the morning, the pressure in the room changed. I don't have a better way to describe it than that. My ears popped, the way they do in a plane during descent, and beside me, Robert's ears popped too, audibly, and he winced and pressed his palm against the side of his head, and Priya said, very quietly, "It's close," in a tone of voice that had given up trying to sound calm about it. The lantern on the table flickered, not from any draft, because the room was sealed, but in a rhythm that matched, exactly, the rhythm of the wind outside, as though the light itself had started listening to the same thing we were. I asked, in a whisper, whether we should be doing something more than just sitting here. Dale answered without looking away from the door. "Sitting here is the something," he said. "Moving is how people get lost. Not lost outside. Lost in a way that doesn't need outside." I didn't ask him to explain that. I didn't want him to. At some point during the worst of it, Robert began speaking, quietly, almost under his breath, in a tone that took me a moment to recognize as a kind of counting, not numbers, but names, a slow, repeated recitation of names I didn't recognize spoken with the flat, worn cadence of something said so many times it had lost its meaning and kept only its function. Like a rosary recited by someone who no longer remembers what they're praying for, only that stopping feels dangerous. I asked him, afterward, who those names belonged to. He looked at me for a long moment before answering, and when he did, his voice was steadier than I expected. "People who didn't sit still," he said. "That's all I'm going to say about it." The storm reached what I can only describe as its peak somewhere near dawn, a pressure and a silence so complete that I could hear my own pulse in my ears louder than anything happening outside the walls. And then, all at once, without any gradual easing, without any of the tapering off that real storms have, it simply stopped, the way a held breath stops when someone finally, unexpectedly, exhales. Nobody moved for a long time after that. Nobody spoke. And when Dale finally stood up and opened the shutters to check the sky, the first gray light of morning showed a landscape blanketed in fresh snow, calm and undisturbed, as though nothing at all had happened there during the night, except that every single instrument on every single tower on the ridge was reading 0, across every measurement, as if the storm had erased not just itself, but the station's ability to prove it had ever existed at all. The morning after the storm, everyone at Harlan Ridge moved like people recovering from an illness they'd all agreed never to name. I found Priya alone in the radio room around mid-morning, staring at the dead instrument readings with an expression that had finally cracked open into something honest. I asked her, plainly, what had actually happened the night before, and for the first time since I'd arrived, she didn't deflect. "I don't know everything," she said. "I want you to understand that first. Nobody here knows everything. What I know is what got passed down to me, the same way it'll get passed down to whoever comes after you." She told me the station had always logged 2 kinds of storms. The kind the outside world was allowed to know about, and the kind that got left out of the official record because acknowledging them, in any documented, traceable way, seemed to make them worse. Nobody could tell her who had first decided this. It had simply always been the rule, inherited the way you inherit a family superstition, not because you understand the mechanism, but because the one time someone broke the rule, something happened that convinced everyone else never to test it again. "What happened the time someone broke it?" I asked. She hesitated long enough that I almost withdrew the question. "There's a name in the old personnel records," she said finally. "You've probably already seen it. Someone logged one of these storms properly years ago. Filed a full report, sent it up the chain, the way you're supposed to with any weather event." She paused. "The storm that came the following week wasn't like the others. It didn't wait for dark. It didn't wait for a shelter code. It just came." She didn't tell me what happened to that person specifically. I didn't ask. Some part of me had already understood, from the dash beside certain names in that old ledger, that asking would only confirm something I wasn't ready to carry. What she did tell me, carefully, like she was handing me something fragile, was that the storms weren't the danger itself, not exactly. They were closer to a kind of covering, a disturbance the station's presence seemed to attract, the way certain lights attract certain insects. Something moved within them. Something that had been moving within them, according to the oldest records anyone at the station had ever found, for far longer than any human structure had existed on that ridge to observe it. "Why here?" I asked. "Why this particular stretch of nothing?" "I don't think it's about the location," she said. "I think it's about the road." I felt something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. She explained, as best she understood it, that the road I plowed, the exact road, the specific corridor of cleared earth I maintained every winter, had existed in some form for far longer than the official maps suggested, tracing a route that predated the station, predated any recorded settlement in that stretch of the interior, following a line across the landscape that seemed to correspond, with unsettling precision, to the red circles marked on that hand-drawn map I'd found in the storage room. "The road remembers," I said quietly, repeating the phrase from the old ledger. Priya's face went very still. "Where did you see that?" I told her about the storage room, about the boxes, about the note addressed to whoever found it next. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she sat back in her chair and was quiet for a long time. "That note wasn't from someone here," she said eventually. "Not exactly. Every few years, someone leaves a note like that for the next person who goes looking. I left one myself, 4 years ago, in a box I never told anyone about." She looked at me. "It's how the ones who figure it out make sure the next ones aren't completely blind. It's the only kindness the job allows." I asked her the question I'd been circling for weeks without letting myself land on it directly. What happens to people who stay long enough to fully understand? She didn't answer that one with words. She simply looked toward the window, toward the ridge, toward the empty white road curving away from the station until it disappeared into the tree line, and something in her expression told me that this was the one question at Harlan Ridge that nobody had ever found a safe way to answer, because every attempt at an answer seemed to require getting closer to the thing being described than anyone who wanted to survive should ever willingly get. That evening, alone in the equipment shed, I made a decision I would spend the rest of the winter regretting and never fully being able to undo. I decided I was going to plow the road at night, during the next storm, no matter what the board said, not to prove anything, not out of courage, but because some deep, exhausted part of me had decided it would rather see clearly and be afraid than keep living inside a fear that refused to show me its shape. I didn't tell anyone. I wrote it down in my notebook instead, the way you write down a decision you're afraid you'll talk yourself out of by morning, and I underlined it twice, and I went to bed knowing, with a strange and total certainty, that the next storm wasn't going to wait very long to arrive. The storm came 4 nights later, and the board in the radio room didn't say, "Hold," or "Shelter." It said nothing at all. Every instrument on the ridge simply stopped reporting at once, the way a room goes quiet when everyone in it hears the same distant sound and decides, together, without speaking, not to mention it. I told Dale I was taking the plow out anyway. He didn't try to stop me the way I expected him to. He looked at me for a long moment, the way you look at someone who has made a decision you recognize because you once made it yourself, and he said only, "Keep the radio on. Don't stop the truck for anything you see. Not anything." Then he added, quieter, almost to himself, "I did this too once. A long time ago." The road at night, in a whiteout, is an act of faith more than an act of driving. You trust the reflector posts. You trust the small, cumulative memory your hands have built up over months of the same route. You trust that the world in front of your headlights is the same world that was there the last time you drove through it. That trust didn't survive the first 3 miles. The reflector posts appeared in the wrong order. Not missing, wrong. Spaced at intervals that didn't match the pattern I'd memorized, as though the road itself had been rearranged in my absence, subtly, the way a room feels wrong when someone has moved the furniture 2 inches while you were sleeping. My headlights caught drifts of snow curling into shapes that held their form for a fraction of a second too long before the wind reclaimed them, shapes that, for just a moment each time, resembled something with a clear, deliberate outline rather than the chaos of blown snow. The radio, propped in its mount beside me, produced a steady wash of static that occasionally organized itself, not into words, not quite, but into something with the shape of words, a cadence that rose and fell the way speech rises and falls, close enough to language that some old buried part of my brain kept trying to translate it, and kept failing, over and over. In a way that felt less like noise and more like something on the other end that hadn't yet learned how to be understood by me. At mile 17, my headlights swept across the road ahead and, for less than a second, illuminated fresh plow tracks already cut into the snow in front of me. My exact pattern, my exact drift on the frost heave, extending forward into the whiteout further than my lights could reach. I did not stop the truck. Dale's instruction repeated itself in my head like something I was gripping onto with both hands. I kept driving, through tracks that were mine and could not possibly be mine, toward a horizon my own plow blade had apparently already carved out ahead of me, hours or days or years before I got there. Somewhere around mile 25, the temperature inside the cab dropped hard enough that my breath became visible despite the heater running at full output, and in that fogging, condensing air, just outside the passenger window, close enough that I could have reached out and touched the glass from the other side, something moved alongside the truck at exactly my speed. I want to be as honest as I can about what I saw, because I think honesty matters more here than drama. I did not see a face. I did not see a clear shape. I saw an absence, a section of the blowing snow that refused to blow, a column of stillness moving parallel to my truck with a patience that had nothing urgent in it at all, as though it had been moving alongside this road, at exactly this speed, for longer than the concept of a truck had existed to keep pace with. I did not look at it directly. I kept my eyes on the road, on the wrong order posts, on the fresh tracks that were already mine, and I said out loud, in a voice that surprised me with how steady it was, "I'm not stopping. Not to it." To myself. A promise I needed to hear in my own voice to believe I could keep it. The stillness stayed beside the truck for what felt like miles, and then, without any transition I could identify, it wasn't there anymore, and the static on the radio resolved, all at once, into something that was almost my name, spoken in a tone with no threat in it at all, which was somehow worse than if it had been threatening, because threat would have at least made sense. I reached the turnaround at the end of the route, and I sat there with the engine running, and when I finally made myself check the mirrors, the road behind me was clear, freshly, perfectly clear, exactly the way it's supposed to look after a plow has done its job, and I understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with proof, that whatever had been keeping pace with me the entire drive had, at some point I never caught, simply stopped, all at once, the way the wind had stopped the very first night I noticed something was wrong. By the time I got back to the station, the sky in the east had already started to gray with the first suggestion of dawn, and the storm, as far as any instrument could measure, had never happened at all. Nobody at Harlan Ridge asked me what I'd seen on the road that night, and I understood, walking back into the main building with my hands still not entirely steady, that this wasn't indifference. It was the sane practiced mercy I'd watched everyone extend to each other for months. The agreement, unspoken and absolute, not to make anyone say out loud what they'd survived. Dale looked at me once, briefly, when I came through the door, and gave a small nod that could have meant a dozen things and probably meant all of them at once. Nobody offered coffee. Nobody asked if I was all right. Priya was already at the radio, logging a routine morning reading in a voice as flat and procedural as the one she'd used every single day since I'd arrived, as though the entire night simply hadn't happened, as though I hadn't spent it driving alongside something that kept perfect pace with my truck for reasons I will never be given. I went to check the weather binder later that day, out of habit more than hope. The previous night wasn't in it. Of course it wasn't. I'd known, somewhere in my chest, before I even opened the cover, that it wouldn't be, that the storm, the tracks already cut ahead of me, the stillness beside the window, all of it had already been folded into the same silence that had swallowed every anomaly before it, filed away in whatever place things go when a station has decided, collectively, without ever holding a meeting about it, that some events are safer unrecorded than remembered. I went looking for the storage room 3 days later, meaning to add my own account to the boxes, the way Priya had told me others did, a note left behind for whoever came next, my small contribution to the fragile chain of unofficial warnings that seemed to be the only thing keeping new arrivals from walking into all of this completely blind. The room was empty. Not cleared out, empty in the sense that the shelving was there, the dust patterns on the floor were there, but the boxes themselves were simply gone, as if they had never been stacked against that wall at all, and when I asked Robert about it, carefully, watching his face for any flicker of the recognition I needed to see, he told me, without hesitation, that there had never been a storage room used for old records, that the space had always just held spare parts, and he said it in a tone so calm, so entirely without deception, that for one long, dizzying moment I found myself doubting my own memory more than I doubted him. That's the part of this I haven't been able to shake since. Not the stillness beside my truck. Not the tracks cut ahead of me in snow I hadn't yet driven through. It's the quiet, creeping suspicion that my own mind might be doing to me exactly what the station's official records did to every storm that didn't fit, smoothing over the edges, filing the impossible parts somewhere I can't easily reach them, so that I can keep functioning, keep driving the route, keep sitting at dinner with people who have clearly made the exact same trade I'm now making without ever discussing it out loud. I finished the winter contract. I don't know, entirely, why I stayed. Some of it was money. Some of it, I think, was the same thing that keeps everyone else at Harlan Ridge coming back season after season, a sense that having gotten this close to understanding something, walking away from it felt like its own kind of unfinished business, even though every rational instinct told me understanding was never actually on offer. Only proximity to something that would let me get close enough to be changed by it, and no closer than that. The last storm of my contract came and went the way all the strange ones did, unlogged, unacknowledged, absorbed into a silence so total that by the following morning, the crew was already talking about something else entirely: dinner plans, the drive out once the season ended, small ordinary things that felt, after everything, like a kind of mercy I hadn't earned and couldn't quite accept. I drove out of Harlan Ridge in the spring, the road finally clear of snow beneath my own tires for what felt like the first time all season, and somewhere around mile 36, the same mile with the frost heave, the same drift my hands still correct for out of habit even now, months later, on roads that have nothing to do with Alaska, I found myself checking my rearview mirror without meaning to, the way you check a wound you've been told has healed. Just to be sure. The road behind me was empty. It was, as far as I could tell, exactly what an empty road should look like. I don't know who's driving that route now. I know someone is, because contracts like that don't go unfilled for long, and stations like that don't stop needing a road kept open, and somewhere in a storage room that either exists or doesn't, depending on who you ask, there's very likely a note waiting for them, written by someone who understood, by the time they left, that the kindest thing they could do for a stranger they'd never meet was to make sure they weren't walking into all of it completely blind. I still plow roads for a living. I still watch my mirrors more than I probably need to. And on certain nights, when the snow comes down heavy and sideways and the reflector posts start to blur together into a rhythm my hands know better than my eyes do, I find myself wondering whether the road is simply doing what roads do, or whether, somewhere beneath the ordinary act of driving through the dark, something out there is still keeping pace with me, patient, unhurried, waiting for the next time I decide to